ready for tomorrow and the next day.
Great.
So everyone can see me and hear me, okay?
Yes.
Great. Let's see. So one thing is just to remind you of the things that we have coming up. Tonight, we have Minyan at 5:45 like we're trying to do each day of the week.
Yep.
And then tomorrow night at 7:30, we're going to do a mindfulness session with Andra LeBauer and myself.
Yep.
And then on Thursday at 2:30, I'm going to do a kind of a drop-in session where anyone can ask any question they want about Passover.
Oh,
So
okay.
kind of coffee with a rabbi idea.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to be working in the next day or two to figure out exactly what we'll be offering Friday night and Saturday morning for Shabbat.
What about Thursday morning minyan? No?
I don't know. I don't know. What do you think, Ruth?
How success? The minyan last night was quite successful. There were over 20 people there. I think we should give it a go.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't work, it doesn't go. I mean, it's up to you. It's up to you.
That makes sense to me. We'll put it in the hopper for sure. Because the more regularity we can have, the better I think we all are.
Yeah, look, it's great. I mean, we're all isolated here, and I think for no other reason but social reason, it's nice to see others.
Exactly. Okay. So let's talk about this text then. Let's get to this Mishnah. And to really get into it, I think we first want to understand who is Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, because his biography might inform how we understand this teaching of his. Okay?
Right.
And it's also going to be the Mishnah of this teaching is actually pretty long, and I split it into two pieces, which is something that people often do, either officially by giving the second half a different number or just by presenting them separately. So learning about Elazar ben Azariah will be helpful towards understanding his teaching, I think. His biography is pretty helpful. So Elazar ben Azariah is a young rabbi or man when he becomes the head of the Sanhedrin, or the head of the rabbinic group. He becomes the head for kind of a peculiar reason that we have to get into other characters in the in the same time frame. So what we're talking about here is a place in the north of Israel called Yavna, which Ruth has probably heard of, but Francis and Margaret, you might not be as familiar with.
Right. That's okay.
So no, it's okay, and I'll just give a quick background. So Yavna, there's a famous teaching that when the Romans destroy the temple, that the rabbis, or the early rabbis, they abandoned Jerusalem and asked the Roman conqueror Vespasian for just to leave them alone. They'll pay their taxes. Just let us be in Yavna, and everything will be okay. Now, we don't know if that's a historical teaching or if that's more of a midrash, but clearly rabbinic teaching and rabbinic Judaism takes root in the north of Israel, what we call the Galilee or the Galil. And Yavna is right up there. So at this time frame, we have one of the last leaders, the last rabbinic leaders of Jerusalem is Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. And he has a son who's named who's referred to as Rabban Gamliel, who then has a son who he names after his father. So we have a second Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. But they all exist in very different places. The first Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel is in Jerusalem, and he is alive while the temple is still functioning, and he's a leader, a very strong leader while the temple is still functioning. Then his son, Rabban Gamliel, becomes the leader of this early rabbinic outpost in Yavna after the destruction. And then his son, the second Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, the second Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who is more well known. Like when you see teachings from Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, they are almost always from the second, not from the first. And he is from the generation that is in Usha. So from the generation that flees the land of Israel after the Bar Kokhba rebellion is crushed and is in Bavel. So why is all that important? So Rabban Gamliel is the leader of the early rabbis in Yavna. And he is trying to really consolidate power. And in doing so, he makes it very clear that he is in charge by putting the onus on people challenging his authority to obey him in public. Right? So he makes them go against their own teaching and follow his teaching in front of all of the other early rabbis. And so that is certainly not a pluralistic move. And after it's happened more than once, that level of public embarrassment leads to a rebellion where Rabban Gamliel is deposed. I mean, he's not killed or exiled or anything, but he is put out of power. And they are looking for a candidate to fill his shoes. And that is where our rabbi today, Elazar ben Azariah, comes in. So Elazar ben Azariah is I got a little, I think, Rebecca behind me.
I have somebody behind them.
I was calling to try to stay out of the camera range, but hi.
Hey there.
I think that's a little bit like that commercial on TV, right, where the little kids are running around all the anyway. So Elazar ben Azariah, when Rabban Gamliel is taken out of power, Elazar ben Azariah is a young erudite man of 18 years old, who is also, so he's smart, he's knowledgeable, but he's only 18. The cinching thing, there are actually two cinching factors. One is that he's young enough that he didn't take a side in the deposition in the deposing of Rabban Gamliel, right? So he's not seen as partisan. That's number one. And number two is that he comes from a wealthy and well-respected family. So he is a figure who can pull things together in a peaceful way. Okay?
Yeah.
Any questions?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
Okay. So when we look at this text, then we can see, we'll see if it has any impact. But to get to that, before we get to the text, I just want to set it into a context. I think that the method that I'm kind of working towards here in the study of Pirkei Avot is that to see Pirkei Avot for what it is, which is a foundational document of early rabbinic values and teachings, right? That's not a new statement. That's pretty obvious, kind of straightforward. But what I like to do for methodology here is to compare the value or the teaching that we see in Pirkei Avot to another teaching or another text or tradition in Judaism, and to see how those kind of balance each other out or how one might inform the other. Right? So what we're going to see in Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's teaching is a binary opposition of one thing versus another, right? There's no X unless you have Y, and there's no Y unless you have X. And we're going to go back and forth with those binary pairs. I think there are 4 of them that we're going to look at and see what is the tension between them and how does one inform the other. And also, not only does how one inform the other, but how does the statement that both of them are required, what is that speaking against? Right? Because when you say that both inform the other and that each one is necessary for the other, you're saying that one thing alone, or one thing even dominant perhaps, is not okay. And I think that is just as important a statement as the other two, as the other kind of more obvious statement, right? It's just as important to say that you can't have, I mean, it's all tied together. So we'll get into that when we talk about it. But this idea of binary pairs of values or of teachings that are in balance with one another is really a core element of rabbinic Judaism. And that's what I wanted to kind of show this morning through another text. And to start with, there are some teachings of 2 other people that kind of set that into context. One is more modern, and that would be the chancellor of my seminary, Chancellor Ismar Shorish, when I was in seminary, who, you know, you do a lot of administrative work, obviously, when you're running an institution of higher education, but he also did work on a text, on a book that he published with his retirement. And that was called, or is still called, Polarities in Balance. Polarities in Balance, right? That just like kind of taking it from the geography of the Earth, that we have, right? We have the North Pole and the South Pole, and the world is in balance between them. Or if we have a positive and a negative current, or if we have, you know, if we have north and south on a magnet, right? We find a balance point between those 2 different forces, and that often that's what rabbinic Judaism is guiding us to do, is to find the 2 values that are in tension with one another, and where does that tension locate us in the middle? And different people are going to find themselves in different places because they understand those poles differently, and they value one maybe a little bit more than another, right? So Chancellor Shorish wrote this book called Polarities in Balance, which is a kind of a statement about
What is the first word? I hear imbalance, but I don't know.
Polarities.
Yeah, again.
Like polarities, like like north and south and magnets.
Okay, got you.
Okay, so polarities in balance, and but let's get to a more specific example, which is a great teaching of Hillel the elder, who we've spoken about before, right? So Hillel, he exists very early, right? He's in the 1st century BCE, before the Common Era, or the 1st century before Christ, and the decades right after the turn from BCE to the Common Era. So he is 1 generation older than Jesus would be, and Hillel is really a monumental figure in our teaching. And there's tension at that time between a number of competing groups in the Jewish world over a number of things, including whether or not there is authority in what we refer to as the oral Torah, the Talmud, and the rabbinic tradition of interpretation that takes the Torah and the rest of the Bible and expands it into what modern Judaism is. And there are groups that say, no, we don't respect that authority. And there are groups that say, yes, obviously. And the groups that say yes are the ones that win out in the end. So Hillel has a great teaching about this, right? So here are the polls that I'm presenting. We have the written Torah, and we have the oral Torah of interpretation, right? And how do those balance one another and guide us is one way to kind of get our minds into this idea of polarities that we're going to see in Elazar ben Azariah in just a moment. So according to this story, a non-Jewish person comes to Hillel and says, convert me is on the condition that I only have to accept the written Torah and not the oral Torah. And Hillel, in his famously patient and understanding way, says, no problem. Let's get started. And he shows him the first 10 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And he teaches him what the sounds of each letter are. He says, memorize these, come back tomorrow. That comes back tomorrow, and Hillel starts pointing at the letters. And the guy will repeat the sounds that Hillel told him the day before. But Hillel keeps telling him he's wrong, right? Hillel is trying to confuse him. And the gentleman gets frustrated and says, what are you doing? You're telling me different sounds today than yesterday. And Hillel says, you see, you can't even know how to pronounce a letter without me telling you, right? You need some sort of you need some sort of interpretive tradition in order to understand the written. And so you cannot make that condition that you're only going to say the written without the oral, because there's always going to be an oral tradition of interpretation around the written, right?
Right.
Okay. So that's just it's a nice story, but it shows like how we are always dealing with these tensions. Let's get right to it now with Elazar ben Azariah. Does anybody have any questions before we get started?
Nope.
So if I'm looking at it, because I'm also, like I said, I'm trying to learn how to do this here. Yeah, so we don't we have to pay a lot more money apparently. There is a way that you can like raise your hand digitally using the app, but only if we pay a lot more money for that part of it.
Okay.
So
No, it's fine.
so just speak up if you you know want
How
to.
many of us are there?
Right now there are 4 of us online.
Okay.
But I think that's probably partially because we didn't get an email out, as Ruth is pointing out, telling everyone that this is when it is and this is how you line up. But we'll be better about that going forward. There, wait a second. There we go. Okay, so rather than trying to, I want to have both screens open. So let's get into Elazar ben Azariah. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Omer. So Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah taught, Im ein Torah, ein derech eretz. If there is no Torah, there is no worldly occupation. V'im ein derech eretz, ein Torah. And if there is no worldly occupation, then there is no Torah. So what do we see here is the tension between the worldly and the spiritual.
Right.
Right? The tension between connection to a higher level of existence and the need for sustenance in the world. And that's a little bit of what we're going to see throughout these different texts. Does anyone have any reaction to that teaching before we get started and diving into it?
So he's putting Torah first.
Yeah, he's definitely putting Torah first, right?
Right.
So you see that there's the putting the spiritual ahead, and we'll see. It doesn't seem to he's not consistent throughout all four teachings. Right. So let's look at, if we go through the whole thing, then we'll come back to the first pair.
Well, I was going to just share, it's just interesting to me because sometimes in Christianity, people just want to study the New Testament.
Ah,
And I was always raised with the old and the new, okay? But
mhm.
to me, there is no Christianity if there is no Torah.
without the Hebrew Bible, right?
Right.
And that's the same tension that we're talking about from Hillel, right?
Right.
You can't just have the new. Well, in Hillel's case, the guy just wants the first thing, not the way of
Right. Exactly.
today.
Yeah.
And in the same way, you could have a similar motivation to say, well, I don't want to have that limitation. I only want to have the teaching of the moment.
Right.
Right. And that's a challenge.
Yeah.
So so there's a fundamental statement here that there's a connection, a necessary connection between spiritual living and sustenance. Now,
Right.
on one level, that's really obvious, right? Because if we're not alive, we can't be spiritual. Okay. But I think there's some more layered interpretation and understanding in this teaching, right? Which I think is important to get into. So how can it be that having a worldly occupation, either specifically or at least in some form, how can that be important to Torah and to understanding the spiritual? So one place to look for an answer, which in the Jewish world, or at least in the traditional Jewish world, we're going to see, is there's a tension today in Israel, especially, but also in parts of Brooklyn and other parts of the United States, where what we call Haredi Jews or ultra-Orthodox or fundamentalist Jews have interpret this a little differently, and they put the value on learning, and that men should be, if they can be, should be engaged in learning or in literal Torah learning as their occupation.
Doesn't it say in the Torah that men should have an occupation, that they should study Torah, but they should also have an occupation? Doesn't it say that somewhere in there?
In the Torah, no, but in rabbinic teaching, yes.
No.
Right. So that's one of the things that's this teaching right here, Ruth. Right. I think this is one of the first places we see it. Is here's Elazar's statement that you should have a worldly occupation along with your pursuit of the spiritual.
How do the Haredi, I wonder, justify then their just Torah study above all and exclusively? I
don't know. I don't know. I'm sure they have a very good, kind of logical answer or logical argument within their world, within their framework, right? Within their world framework. Mm-hmm. But, exactly, that's a challenge. So,
well, we also had, in Christianity, we also had that tension in that when Paul came, he said he was a tent maker and he was dependent on no one. Like he felt like he had his job, but he also had his other to preach the gospel, but he never gave up his job to be a tent maker and make his own living.
And if we look at rabbinic history,
tension, yeah,
there are very few in the first, even through the Middle Ages, there are very few examples of rabbis who don't have an occupation.
Right. That would have been my thing on thinking of it.
But they almost all do. And I think that's important for a lot of reasons, right? One is that, just to give it, an example, right? When I was an it's kind of along these lines. When I was an assistant rabbi for 5 years, probably way too frequently, I had the thought process where I would say to myself, you know what? That's okay for now, but when I'm in charge, it'll be this way.
That's what we said when we were kids. That's what we said when we were kids.
Exactly, right? And now some of those probably did come true. Yet and that's a natural feeling, right? That's not like, I'm not like beating myself up over having had those thoughts. However, I think when I reflect upon some of those reactions, there was a quicker tendency towards purity, or towards a more, not partisan, but maybe more pure theological expression, right? Rather than taking into account the person sitting across the table from me, or the person who's asking the question. And when you're the rabbi who's at the other, when you're the rabbi who is, across from your congregant, and you have to really deal with the fact that what your decision is going to impact their life, and perhaps the life of the congregation, well, then it takes on a different weight.
Right.
And all of a sudden, I discovered a new humility, right? When I felt the weight of that.
Right.
And I think that's, if I had a guaranteed number of congregants and a guaranteed income and salary for the synagogue, well, then maybe I would be less considerate of the people sitting in front of me. But there's an element of responsibility that comes from that informs my understanding of the Torah. Right? There's a very famous teaching that is quoted in the name of a number of different people. I'm sure it's been said many times by different rabbis in different places. But right, one of the things that a rabbi used to do much more so, or not even much more so, but really, because we don't do it almost at all today, but back, 50, not even, let's say 100 years ago, 80, 100 years ago, when we didn't have refrigeration, right? So you couldn't ship meat across straight lines or great distances. Then, if you wanted a chicken, you went to your butcher in your town, you picked out the chicken in the yard, and then the butcher, who was also a trained slaughterer, would slaughter the chicken.
Right.
And you had to have your local rabbi make decisions about if there were questions about whether that chicken was kosher, if something of its physical condition might make it unkosher, right?
Right.
And on one level, those laws are black and white, but on another, there's many places where you can have space to interpret based on the conditions in front of you, right?
Yeah.
And so there are any number of rabbis who've been quoted as saying, I can't tell you if the chicken is kosher or not unless I know who's asking the question. Meaning, like, if I have to know that if I say that this chicken is not kosher, that the family that I'm declaring that for will have something else to eat.
Right.
Right? And that's a very, it's a well-worn teaching, but I think it's one that's well-worn because it has so much truth in it for someone who really wants to be in the congregational world. And when you are in a kind of this pure sense where you are only, and I don't mean pure like in a good way, but when you are only concerned with the Torah side, but not with the people side, then I think you are liable to miss out on things.
Do you think that's what they meant? That's what this rabbi meant when he said the first occupation Torah?
I do think so. I think that if we look at the Mishnah in Brachot, for example, which is all about the foundations of Jewish prayer and ritual life. We're required to say the Shema every morning and every evening, right?
Right.
And you're supposed to say it with complete intention, right? Your focus can only be on the Shema and not on anything else. And so you might think that if you were, say your occupation, your worldly occupation, took you out of the house before sunrise, right? And you're not supposed, one of the conditions on the Shema in the morning is you're not supposed to say it until the sunrise, right?
Mm-hmm.
So say you have an occupation where you have to be out of the house before dark. Well, are you going to be able to say the Shema, right? And fulfill your obligation to be spiritually involved in the duties? Well, they actually consider this question, and they seem to have a knowledge of different occupations, the early rabbis, about if you have this occupation, it's okay. If you have this occupation, it's okay. If you have this occupation, then no, because you would be putting yourself in a place of danger, and that's not okay. And also because you would not be able to concentrate, right? So in that way, I think that's kind of a simple way of demonstrating it. But having had to work for a living and having had do occupations or have those kinds of responsibilities, I think it brings a lot more nuance to our understanding of Torah than just studying the words and being a part of that system of understanding on its own. But how does that agree with your?
It's more humanistic and taking into account humans.
For sure. And I'm wondering, here, one of the things that we're seeing in this Mishnah is the tying together of competing, what could be seen as competing values. And in our world today, this is something that we probably need more and more of, right? Where more and more people are going for some sort of ideological purity. And what we need really is the balance between those. So I kind of see this Mishnah as really being necessary for today, really informing the world,
Frequently in your occupation, you're running against temptations that are kind of forcing you to make a decision. And if you don't have Torah, you'll probably make the wrong decision.
Can you say that again, Francis? I didn't hear the beginning.
I'd say in today's world, frequently in your occupation, you are forced to make choices. But do you want your job or do you not want your job? So if you don't have Torah, it's harder to make that conflict is not always clear.
Great, so that's a great turn to a third thing, right? A third element. So if we're talking about, we have the need for sustenance to have a spiritual life. That's one thing.
Right.
And if we need a kind of a connection to this world in an intimate way through a worldly occupation to help us understand the words of Torah better, right? Then Francis, you're kind of flipping it in a beautiful way and saying, right, what we need in order to be able to really live in the world in a good way, we need to go to work with the understanding of Torah. Whatever, with that spiritual pursuit as well. Am I getting kind of where you're coming from?
Like if my boss says, I want you to dump this waste in the pit.
Yeah.
Your understanding of the world is through Torah this is God's world. I shouldn't be polluting it first, and then you realize, well, I'm going to harm someone else too. And,
right, exactly. So there's if you don't have that kind of ultimate connection and inspiration and sense of responsibility, then what keeps you from straying too far, right? Absolutely. So any last thoughts on this first pairing, this first coupling of Torah and a worldly occupation?
We're fine.
Okay. We'll go to the second one, which is also an interesting thing to interpret. By the way, there is, before we go off the first pairing, the words derech eretz here in the Mishnah are commonly understood as worldly occupation. However, today, when we say derech eretz, which literally means kind of the path of the world, or the path of the land. I mean, derech is path, and eretz is land, like as in Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. So it's commonly understood as occupation. However, in modern Hebrew, and not just in modern Hebrew, but in other places, derech eretz would mean good ethical behavior, right? Or good, not even ethical, but more moral behavior, right? If someone has derech eretz, that means that they're kind of a good moral person. And if you don't have it, then you are, then you don't, then you're an amoral person. So we could understand it in that way here as well, but that's not the common understanding. So that's just an FYI. And Marilyn, I see you're on here, and you're muted. I don't know if you know this, but you're muted. So I see your microphone going up and down, but it's just a video. Sorry, you can talk.
Oh, I'm just saying hello. I just tuned in late.
Great. Do you have the text, or do I need to get it to you again?
I did not get the text. No.
So if you put your cursor at the bottom, well, you're on your iPad, right? So if you put your
if I can go find a copy of the Pirkei Avot, if you tell me what chapter you're in, I have that downstairs. Is that what you're doing?
Well, yeah. So, but
it's okay. I don't mean to interrupt.
No, it's okay. Just let you know that I did download the file. So if you go into the chat function, okay, then you can in the chat function you can download the text because it's right there.
Okay, I'll look for it. Please continue. Don't let me stop you.
Not at all. Not at all. I'm just putting it right back up there because it seems like it doesn't just stay there. It has to be on there after you've signed in. So I put it up there again.
So I think I'm in the chat function.
Okay.
But I don't see anything.
Okay.
It says it's all right. Don't worry about it.
Okay. It is the first teaching of Elazar ben Azariah, right? So it's in some teachings, it's if you're looking at Pirkei Avot in a separate collection, it would be Mishnah 17.
All right, I'll go look. I'll be back. Continue,
okay. So the second teaching, Im ein chochma ein yirah, im ein yirah ein chochma. If there is no wisdom, there is no fear of God. Or piety, I think we could read that as either fear or awe of God or piety. And if there's no fear of God or piety, then there is no wisdom. Okay? So here, we want to look at these words. In particular, chokhmah, which does mean wisdom, and is also one of the words that we use to describe the early rabbis, the hachamim. So we turn it, we make it into like a category of person. So a hacham is a wise person. Hachamim, or the hachamim, are the, in early rabbinic literature, is the collection of the majority of rabbis. when there's a debate between one rabbi and a larger group. So in that setting, you might see like Rabbi Meir says this, and Chachamim say that, and Chachamim is just the majority. But here, right, it's the I don't know how you distinguish between the nouns, right? Because it's a noun also, but wisdom, in general, or sorry, religious wisdom perhaps, and then we see that in contrast with yirah, which literally usually is translated as fear, but it's not the kind of fear that we would mean like you're afraid of a particular situation, like you walk into a dark room and you tremble. That would be pachad. It's a different verb. Yirah is more about a sense of smallness and awe and fear about mortality. Okay? And so here, right, what's the tension between wisdom and piety or fear of God? Anybody have any first reactions? Okay, well, so wisdom, right? Wisdom is the ability to collect knowledge and to discern which pieces of knowledge are more valuable or more important than others.
Yeah.
Does that sound like a working definition?
That's good.
Okay. Right. So the place of yirah or fear of God is in this situation is in helping us to bring relief to the various bits of knowledge that we gain.
What do you mean by
Right?
relief?
Does that make sense?
What do you mean by relief?
Oh, like as in like in a map in relief, you know, where you have the topography is done by giving shape to it. So here, yirah or fear or kind of awe of God helps us kind of, instead of seeing all of the facts that we know kind of on an equal footing and without any differentiation between them, perhaps it is one of the things that helps us recognize some as more important than others, or at least in certain situations, and to make judgments between bits of knowledge is yirah, is awe or fear of God.
Another way I was thinking of it too is maybe you have the wisdom, but if you have lost the love in what you're doing, God is, I think so God is love or whatever. But if you're busy have the knowledge of all the rules and regulations, and then you forget to have love through that. To me, that would be the fear of God.
So the fear of God here, but like I said, it's not about.
Well, I meant piety. I mean, it's like
It's not like
I don't know how. I'm not explaining it very well, but sometimes people are doing, like maybe at religious schools, beating the children or something. They're not showing the fear of God.
They're not
the piety. Yeah. That's what I'm trying to say.
Because they're seeing themselves as too, well, in that situation, right?
You better keep you have to keep, and I think it's like your chicken story. It's that kind of a thing where sometimes you have to, that's what I think of as the God part, the fear or the piety.
Yeah, and one of the challenges with the word of piety is that oftentimes in the Jewish world at least, I don't know if this is the same in the Christian world. But in the Jewish world, oftentimes we use the word religious or pious not to describe a person's moral or ethical behavior, but their ritual behavior.
Right.
Following following the rules.
Following, yeah, and we think of it more of that. Yeah.
As well, right?
Yeah.
Ruth, does that work? Does that kind of work with what you're understanding too, Ruth?
Well, I think there is an implication that a pious person is probably a moral person, but it's just somewhere in there. But yeah, I think more ritualistic is the point. Yeah.
Right, and I think that almost all the translations I consulted when I kind of looking at this Mishnah translated yirah here as fear. One pushed it and used the word pious or piety, because I think he's trying that author is trying to suggest that we should be looking at piety in a more holistic way, and also that piety is not the sole place is not a place only for Jews, but is a place for everyone. Like people can be pious from any tradition.
In the old and in your Bible too, there's the part where it says, I think it's Psalm 1. It's either Psalm 19 or 1. It says the fear of the Lord is clean.
The fear of the Lord is
But
what?
I don't know if that's your interpretation or not. But that was in my Bible, that the fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. I don't know. That's I just thought that was an interesting way of putting it.
Yeah. Do you know which psalm it is?
I think it's Psalm 19 or
19.
Psalm 119. So
Psalm 119 is very, very long.
okay.
So it could very easily be
I'll try and look it up when I'm here, and I'll let you know.
because actually one of the texts from the second part of Rabbi Elazar's teaching is from Psalm 119. No, it's actually sorry. There's a something I was looking up. It's not from this teaching.
It's the law of the Lord.
Can't hear you.
Yeah, fading out.
We lost you there, Francis. Margaret. Sorry, Margaret. Okay, well, I think when your bandwidth comes back, we'll hopefully be able to hear you again. Okay, so let's take a look. Since it's 11, let's try and finish up here, maybe too quickly. The third coupling here, right, is im ein bina ein da'at. Im ein da'at ein bina. If there is no knowledge, there is no understanding. If there is no understanding, there is no knowledge.
That makes sense.
That makes sense to us. Read it with
Right, that's pretty straightforward, right? Because, like, how can you have understanding if you don't know something? How can you know something if you don't have? How can you make sense of the world if you don't have a little bit of understanding, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're just kind of overwhelmed with everything, or just taking someone else's word for it and following what they tell you to do, but that's not really understanding or knowledge. Right?
Yeah.
It's the last one that I would like to discuss because
let's get into that one. That's our favorite. This is one of our favorite ones in rabbinical school, right? When we take a break or have a beer or something like that, oftentimes the quote would be "Im ein kemach ein Torah," right? If there's no flour, there's no Torah. Im ein Torah ein kemach, and if there's no Torah, then there's no flour.
Right.
And flour here representing again sustenance or
right.
The ability to that we are not ascetic. We're not supposed to separate ourselves from the world completely and live monastically. This is one of the ways that rabbinic Judaism is very different than some forms of Christian practice or Buddhist practice or even Muslim practice. There are ascetic practices in Judaism, but not to that degree. And the most what's the most famous ascetic Jewish sect? from about this time, or a little bit earlier than this time period of Elazar ben Azariah.
I wanted to go back to the fear of God.
Can we do that, Francis? Can we do that in just 1 second?
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay, just 1 second. So let me.
asking a question.
So the earliest, the sect I'm talking about are the Essenes, the ones who were responsible for the Dead Sea
Right,
Scrolls,
okay, excellent, right, okay,
right? Because they were very ascetic. They lived. They left Jerusalem, which they saw as being corrupt. They
right.
lived down by the Dead Sea, and they didn't believe in sex, which tells you.
Oh my gosh.
I didn't know that.
That's why they, yeah.
Number one, right? That's your first way to assure yourself of not being successful for a long period of time, right? And we can see
Right.
that the Shakers did the same
Right,
thing.
oh yeah,
Great furniture, but it didn't. There were limits to how far it could go.
right,
And the other thing is, it's actually quite a rebellion from the Torah or Rabbinic Judaism, which tells us very explicitly to be fruitful and multiply.
that's right, that's right.
Right. So it really turns that on its head. You have to come up with some creative methods of interpretation
Right.
in order to do so. So, right. So we're not meant to, according to Elazar, and don't forget, he's the man of wealth, right? Or he has some wealth to him, and he has some comfort. We're not meant to be all in one place or all in another, right? It's not about all business or all revelation in Torah, but they are supposed to be intimately connected one with the other. And I think that it's in the same way that we see the other values kind of not just out of necessity being connected to one another, but informing each other, right? That you can read the Torah one way if you don't have to earn a living, and if you don't really want to be concerned with enjoying the world that God created. But if you do need to be concerned with earning a living, and we consider that the world is created by God, is here for us to enjoy in a responsible way, but to enjoy, well then, it gives a whole different color and a whole different valence of understanding to Torah. And I think that's the beautiful teaching of Elazar ben Azariah, is that there's some beautiful meaning that comes about in the combining of these two values, right? It's not just about these two different values at war with one another and us locating ourselves based on how we interpret them, but that in the conflict and in the contrast between them, we get valences and nuances of meaning that we wouldn't get otherwise. And that's, I think, the beauty of his teaching here.
Yeah, I like that.
Francis, you wanted to say something about fear?
I was trying to rationalize, how did God-fearing men and women agree with slavery?
Oh,
I mean, they're
Good question,
following
yeah.
their rules, but their fear did not extend to that person. They were human beings.
Well, I think that's a great question, right? And anybody else? Anyone have any first answers or ideas? Well, what I would throw out is that, at least in rabbinic interpretation of Torah, we have pretty consistently been, we start out with kind of like the United States Constitution in the Torah, right? Which meaning that landowning men are people, and everyone else is beneath them and of a lower level, right? Now, it's not quite that same exact pattern, but it's similar. And over the course of time and history, what we see is the continuous elevation of the people who are not at that level, getting closer to that level, right? So even we can trace the place of women, for example, in a similar trajectory, where in the Torah they are not people in the way men are, but that throughout rabbinic history, there's an increasing kind of equality or sense of equality that today we have completely in our synagogue, and Orthodoxy is sometimes inching its way towards and sometimes not.
It's the
Right?
culture of the times, I think. Look, throughout history, I mean, cultures have been different and things have been acceptable to them that today we would think would be abhorrent. Slavery was okay at the time. It was a cultural okay.
But also to give the Torah its due with the slaves, whenever you had a feast, everybody was, if you did the Passover, even your slaves were there.
Yeah.
They were not kept separate, right? I mean, it was you and your household and the foreigners and the slaves that had to be included. So there was inclusion, which, where our slaves had no inclusion. You could not sit at the table with them. They could not be, there was completely never a time when you could be, when you could
and
in the front door. Yeah.
it actually goes all the way back to the 10 Commandments.
Right. Yeah.
Right, where we say that we're supposed to Zachor Yom HaShabbat L'Kadsho, right? We're supposed to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy.
And
then we list all the people who do, and it's you and and here women are included, right? So it's not you and your wife; it's just you, meaning men and women, your son, your daughter, and your servant, your male servant, your female servant, all of your animals. Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And so that's not and we see that kind of. Ruth is right that throughout time we've seen different levels of acceptable behavior about different things.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if we look at, if we're going to quote Martin Luther King Jr., right, the arc of development has been towards equality and towards increasing values, even if there have been aberrations, right, in short periods of time. But the arc of that development is towards equality and towards shared.
Right.
You were talking about balance. I think there's always a desire for occupation or acquisition to get ahead of the spiritual, or the spiritual to tamper down the occupation. I think that's a tension we live in.
We need both, absolutely. Well, let me say thank you for your willing participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
First of all, it's also just great to see your faces, right? Like, because I'm getting, I feel optimistic and inspired a little bit that this is going to be a useful tool for us.
Yeah, for sure.
So we'll spread the word, and we'll get better publicity out there. We'll be here same time next week for this class.
Okay.
And we have other things going on during the week if you want to check in on those, and we'll be getting emails out about those.
Okay.
Is there some way?
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Rabbi, is there some way that you can, like at the Beth David homepage, there's some kind of link there where if there is something going on, we can just, instead of having to receive an email for each program, I mean, that's okay too, but it would be really nice if there was just a place where we could go and hook in,
Yes, Corey says in the chat, this is cool. See, yes, it is going up today after we get through all of our edits.
Okay, so it'll be at the site, you think, at the homepage?
That's what she's saying.
Okay,
Corey, is that what you're saying that?
Yeah, as soon as we get our calendar fixed, everything will be on the homepage and on the calendar on our website.
And so the links will be there. Okay,
The links will be there. They'll be on social media. They'll be on email. We're going to try to get it as widely distributed as possible.
Very good.
Awesome.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay.
Have a good day.
Have a good day.